Welcome to Circuosity Point 21. Today's guest is Dr. Hugh O'Doherty, adjunct professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Hugh joins us to talk about hope, justice, and our abilities to work across boundaries of tribalism and prejudice towards a greater world. Offer a prayer as we begin. Welcome to Circuosity Point 21. I'm one of your hosts, Jim Strader-Sasser.
And I'm your other host, Howie Sasser.
And we are delighted beyond the lights to have a really great teacher, friend, educator, and peace and reconciliation expert with us today. Dr. Hugh O'Doherty. Hugh, how are you this afternoon?
I'm very well, thank you both. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored to be on your podcast.
Well, we are honored to have you here. I know a bit about your life, and Howie knows a bit about your life, but our listeners don't know most likely too much about your life. So would you be willing to give us a 3 to 4 minute flyby of who you are, where you come from, and how you wound up to be at the Harvard Kennedy School?
I'll give it a shot. I suppose the main trajectory of my life is comes out of, having been born, raised Catholic in Northern Ireland, which is a place that's still deep in conflict. The killing has stopped, but it's still very intractable, still very tremendous mistrust between Protestant community identifying as British and Catholic identifying as Irish. So growing up in that environment as the minority was very shaping for me. And just give you one little story about that. When I was like 8 or 9 years old, my older brother, I have a brother who's 3 years older, he would take me on Saturday afternoons, he'd take me to the matinee performance in the local cinema. Now this is a small town, probably about maybe 25,000 people. So on a Saturday afternoon, it's, your neighbors. And at the end of the movie, the lights would go on and Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth would come riding across the screen on a white horse. And all the Protestants would stand to attention and the British national anthem would be played, And everyone was singing, God save our gracious Queen, God save our noble Queen. Now, if you're Catholic, this is not your culture. In fact, this is the enemy. This is the oppressive colonial British. So what do? The lights go on and you're caught. So I would take my cue from my brother, and sometimes he would walk out, and I'd walk behind him, and my eyes would be on the ground. I didn't want to catch anyone's eyes because we're insulting their culture, And that was terrifying. And as soon as we get outside the door, we'd run, just in case.
Mm.
So sometimes he would walk, sometimes he wouldn't. He would stand, not quite to attention. He would shuffle the body, maybe whisper to me. And you knew, and I remember, even at that age, there's a part of me felt, well, it's fine. It's not our culture. It's theirs. You're supposed to love your neighbor. This is fine. It's all right, And the other voice is saying, no, you're just a coward, just screw them, like walk. And the thing about it was, and it's very interesting, because a lot of these situations of deep, intractable conflict, communities have learned survival strategies. And the survival strategy that we learned as the Catholic community in that town was just before the lights came on, you would hear this shuffle. It was all the Catholics racing for the door to get out before the lights would come up. So we weren't trapped in that dilemma,
Mm-hmm.
So that's what it was like, for like to just grow up very fearful. And there were two police forces. There was the normal police force, which was 93% Protestant, when we were 43% minority. So there's no representation in the police force. And not only that, there was a force called the B Specials. And they were terrifying, because they could stop you at, different patrols. You didn't know who they were, but you knew what their purpose was. And that was to keep Northern Ireland British,
Given where you began, how did you end up in the peacemaking work?
I started life as a high school teacher, just what we call the Troubles. The whole place blew up in violence. And, I was involved in the first curriculum development effort called Religion in Ireland, that was trying to get curriculum materials into Catholic and Protestant schools. Very basic stuff to help clear up some misunderstandings. What's in a chapel, what's in a church, If you're a Protestant and you dip your hands in holy water, will the devil get you? That sort of stuff. But the thing about this was, we spent about a year producing these teaching units, and none of us even noticed, or we noticed unconsciously and didn't talk about it, that there were 15 Protestant teachers, 15 Catholic, and we never talked to each other about what was happening for us. How were we shaped in the midst of it? And, in this leadership work that I'm involved with, we talk about technical problems, and where you have information and skills, but adaptive problems where you have multiple interpretations of what the problem is. We didn't have any of that framework, but now I look back and see it was a classic avoidance, unconsciously. We felt like we were doing something, but we didn't see that we were totally incapable of talking to one another. And that dawned on me after the event. And there were a lot of things that were happening, like I'd father of 3 boys, Protestant boys in my street, lost his arms and legs in a car bomb explosion that killed 7 people. A young 15-year-old young woman who'd been in, I was teaching English literature and French. She had been in both my classes the previous year. 3 gunmen arrived in her home and they shot her mother, her aunt, and brother, I think it was. And again, I have no idea why that family were caught up in the troubles, but it was one thing after another. And I realized that the education system in Northern Ireland isn't offering anything. In fact, you still have a situation where only 4% of children attend integrated schools. All the rest, the tribes are set up very quickly. You attend Catholic school, Protestant school, and that's still the case. There was a study by the churches on what are the churches making a contribution to peacemaking in Northern Ireland, and it was a very devastating report. They said, no, in fact, the opposite, that they're perpetuating it because they're benefiting. The payoff from the conflict is that the two religions, it makes them more cohesive, and they stay together for security and all of that. And the irony is, after the peace agreement happened, the attendance started to drop quite precipitously. And I ended up studying, getting a master's degree in theology of ecumenism from, because I had nothing better to do. But I'm very grateful for it, because the program was in 3 different parts. One was like a study of interfaith dialogue, and another part, how do religious communities live out their spiritual beliefs in the type of communities they create. And so part of that was, I hooked up with the Jewish community. There was 3,000 Jews at that time living in Dublin, trying to live out their Jewish faith in the midst of Catholic Ireland. So I started going to synagogue. And that was a revelation to me. That was like, here I am, I sort of plucked out of Northern Ireland in this madness, this conflict about religion and identity. And I'm now in Dublin, and here I'm in the midst of this Jewish community trying to live out their faith in Catholic Ireland. And it was just, it really, it just opened me up to a whole sort of beginning of like a global perspective. And people would invite me home, for Friday evenings for the Shabbat meal. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful opening of the heart, take me out of this narrow confines of Catholic Protestant Ireland, And that led to becoming a program director in a Peace and Reconciliation Center. There were 2 of these created in Ireland. And, they were trying to figure out dialogue. What does it mean? How do you get people together from these different communities? And what does it mean to try and promote dialogue and peace? And none of us had any clue about it. But we were very good-hearted. and so that was a sort of the trajectory that got me into into this peacemaking arena.
There's a defining moment in your life, though, I think, in that Peace and Reconciliation Center, having to do with people who were trying to claim their space, claim their property, literally. And you ran into a difficult situation, I would say. Would you care to share that with a Mr. X, if you will?
Well, Ireland was traditionally, because of colonialism and the internalized oppression, they were like following the English. And so what was happening in England at this particular time, that a lot of inner cities were being redeveloped. People were being pulled out of inner cities into these huge apartment buildings, And so that's the Dublin City Council started to do the same. The inner city was, very deprived area. And so they built these 9, 12-story blocks out in an area called Ballymun, or just outskirts of the city. No facilities, nothing. And they rehoused people. Now the good thing about it was the housing was of a good quality. It was like they had central heating, and compared to the accommodation in the inner city. So there was a good intention. The downside was it ripped up communities, support communities. And so you had a situation where a lot of the people that came from the inner city were young, unmarried, single mothers. And so they were stuck out in this area with no supermarket, they had to buy goods. They had to jump on a bus, maybe with a couple of kids, and go into this town and come back. And the elevator wasn't working, and they lived on the 10th floor, and you have a shopping bag with goods, and all sorts of problems. The community was divided. There were 2 Catholic parishes. There were different voting precincts, and an unemployment rate of 90%. It was the poorest neighborhood in Ireland. And I was invited. I remember like four-member team who were invited in to support this community. There's about 30 people who came together, and they weren't totally broken in spirits. They still had some energy and some sense of, and their challenge was, can we find a way to bring this community together to speak with one voice? Because there were, everywhere you could fragment a community, they were fragmented. So we were in there, and we started talking. Well, what are the challenges? What is the current reality in this community? And as we were exploring all of this, what bubbled into the conversation was that a large sum of money for this very poor community had been raised for a working men's club. Now, why a working men's club and not working mothers club? That's a whole other issue. But in any case, there was no working men's club. So then what had happened to money? Well, the theory, it started to come into the theory was the money had gone to the local battalion of the Irish Republican Army for weapons to fight the British in the north. Now you can imagine this is like very delicate issue that's surfacing, And I happened, in the middle of this, I happened to be there, in front with the group, and knock comes to the door. And I go over, we're in a classroom in the high school, the local high school, and I open the door and there's this guy standing there, long black coat, dark sunglasses. And he says to me, Mr. X, who was, the local battalion commandant, Mr. X would like to speak with you. So I follow him out the corridor in the school, at the front door, and there's the black car. Window rolls down, Mr. X, the dark glasses, dark coat. And I sort of had to lean down to speak through the window. And he says to me, I believe you're talking about me in there. You can hear my nervous laughter already. and I said to him, and this is all I remember. All I remember is I said to him, yes, would you like to come in and share your point of view? and I think, like, on the one hand, I think, wow, what a genius moment for me. I was like, what a moment of, on the other hand, maybe it's a moment of insanity, how do you weigh it up? But what happened was, like, it was a very tense, you can imagine like the tension in that moment. But after that, it's like, I felt tension drops, like, huh. And he didn't come in, and I don't remember anything we talked about. But the powerful thing about that moment for me was I had to walk back into the classroom, walk in and face the group. And now what do I do? Because I did feel that there was a threat. I didn't feel it was very strong, because he drove off, but there was still an edge, of what happens if we keep this going. And so I had that voice, and the other thought, well, if I stifle this conversation, I've sabotaged everything of the values that we espouse in this work. And for me, it was like that sense of purpose was stronger than the fear. That's ingrained in me now. That to me, so as I work in the field of leadership, and to me, like, if you're not standing clearly in purpose, then you can be swept away by any kind of emotion, fear, despair. It doesn't matter. So to me, a lot of the work in peacemaking and leadership is what purpose can people connect to that will hold them steady for the long haul, given that there is no immediate fix. There isn't even a roadmap. The journey's got to be worked out together.
So it's interesting to me with using the Magi, the trip of the Magi as a backdrop for this series, because the Magi are in search of the divine. And so they're willing, at least one interpretation of the story is they're willing to bounce through any sort of boundary to get to their purpose, which is to find the Messiah. And so they have an encounter with Herod. That's the only one we sort of know of. And then they have an encounter with Mary and Joseph, who are obviously in some ways the other. Well, my interpretation of the story is that their loss of their identity as mages or as astrologers or as priests is secondary to their purpose. And their purpose is to encounter the divine in such a way as to have a life-changing event. Have you experienced a similar sort of circumstance in your work where there was just a powerful, miraculous breakthrough?
I can point to a couple of moments in my own life, like it's interesting, like this idea of the search, like my spiritual teacher says, one of the lesson of life is that you can't find happiness. That if you stop in any moment and consider, what am I up to? We're seeking, we're looking for happiness, the searching. He says, the search is the problem, because the divine, God, reality, whatever we call, is already the case. The divine, only we don't live in that recognition, where we live as, the various traditions of it today, the ego, the separated ego, like separate, where, the Hindu tradition talks about wherever there is an other, fear arises. So everything is other. The world is other. The universe is other. My own body is other. And whereas, if reality is reality, if divine is divine, the divine is already present.
Have you found, as you've gone around different places, that conflict is always particular, always local, or are there universal and sort of cross-cultural aspects to it?
It's always local, but I think the fundamental dynamics are the same. In the field of conflict resolution, there are various theories, but one that's very prominent is the idea that the human needs theory. Now, like, essentially, the theory is that human beings have three essential needs: for acknowledgement, for safety, and for identity. And there's a guy, John Burton, who was Australian, who sort of was the first person to sort of write about this. But the interesting thing about it is the idea is these three are non-negotiable. And one of my great mentors was a man, Herb Kelman at the Harvard, who had developed an approach to conflict resolution called the interactive problem-solving approach, working with Palestinians and Jews, Israelis. And I had been involved with him as a member of a third party, in these workshops. And it took me a while to figure it out, but I realized why I was uncomfortable. And I recognized that, acknowledgement, of course. Safety, of course, people need to feel safe. But if identity isn't negotiable, where do you go? What's possible? And what I recognized was this idea that's still prevalent, around the idea of dialogue. If we bring, Palestinians together, Israelis together, and we tell you our story, you tell us your story, we humanize one another, and somehow that humanizing process will be enough to help us create peace, move into the sunset. And I reckon that ain't real. I realized it, very early on when as Irishmen, we start to meet with Englishmen, that in that moment of dialogue, if it's going to be real, you cannot truly enter into it and come out the way you went in. Something has to give, because if it doesn't give, you just have the same pattern. And so what I realized what has to give is it's the need to have the other as your enemy to define who you are. In other words, I'm Irish because we're not those bastards, you know, those British. I'm French because I'm not German, you know. And so this sort of basic self identity definition as human beings that's separate, where we keep separating. Although all the great spiritual traditions espouse there's only one. We're one in the divine. We're one, you know. A wonderful concept at an espoused level, right?
Oh.
But and so that recognizing that the piece that that a lot of the conflict resolution work doesn't get at is loss.
Yes.
Loss. People don't resist change, they resist loss. And that loss can be real, you know, it can be real in terms of like the resource of very concrete, like land, Northern Ireland, you know, the fourth green field, or Palestine, you know. Or it can be, it's not concrete, but it's identity. It's your sense of values. It's your sense of loyalty. It's your culture. And the more and more in my life now, I see there is no distinction between, I mean, again, quantum physics, all of it tells us that there is no distinction between the internal system and the external. It's, we project out into the universe everything that, you know, that's internal.
No. So I'm not sure I would equate the Kennedy School of Government with a Jesuit school of ecumenism. So how's that working for you? Do you enjoy it? What's that work like for you?
Yeah, the wonderful thing about the Kennedy School is that almost 50% of the student body is global. So I teach a class of like 100 students, and there may be as many as like 22 different countries represented. So it's fantastic in that sense. You have a sense of like it's the globe, the world, the human family, you know. I love that aspect of it. And it's a resource that Harvard, if Harvard were to harness it more purposefully, you know, and recognize the potential of that, it would be powerful. But this is a good example of that as a base for me. Like I was in Ghana last week, or the week before last, a leadership program. And a former student of mine from about 3 years ago, she's Ghanaian, was back in her country. And she heads up a major organization now and appointed by the president. And we met, and she tells me, would I be an advisor now? She wants to be the next president of Ghana. And that same day, I had an email from a student from my class last year who's Liberian. And he tells me he wants to get elected as the next president of Liberia, and would I be a mentor for him? Wow. So I could see here I am, like, wow, there's a possibility of playing some sort of a role with these two people in Africa. So how do you, there's no, you know, explaining it, but it's like, it's very mysterious how I ended this, my life trajectory from Northern Ireland to be in a place where I can perhaps be a resource to two people in Africa, you know.
My usual role in this is to try to bring it back to the sort of the audience who's listening. Really, you've had a very experience on a very large scale and a very large stage. And we should all be grateful for those who do that kind of work and are willing to take those sorts of risks. But I wonder if some of the people who are listening perhaps have conflict of a much more small scale, personal, but just as tragic nature in their own lives. alienation between parents and children and between spouses and between neighbors and coworkers and all of that. Is there anything you can offer as an advice to how people might go about conflict, coming to grips with the conflict that they find in their own lives? Are the principles the same, or?
Hey, this is exactly the same. In fact, I would say where I've learned most is in my intimate relationships. I can continue that my partner, Joan, we will still get to that moment of intractability, where everything, there's a great couples therapist here in Boston, and he talks about, do you want to be right or do you want the relationship? And like we constantly catch ourselves, in that battle about being right. Where's peace in my life, And how do I get triggered by shame? And the legacy of being Irish and all we've internalized about that shame of being inferior, and all of that is really in families and intimate relationships. And you have to find some process of beginning to, for self-observation, begin to observe the dynamics. In leadership, I think one of the key sort of capacities, or in a way what you're doing in leadership work in this conflict is you're trying to hold up a mirror to the system, so the system can see itself in a way that when people are swept away in the battlefield, in war or in families, they're swept away, they can't see, they're lost in the dynamics. So there has to be some way to look in the mirror and take responsibility for this system that's being created. And, if you have two people, you have person A and you have person B, but really there's a C. And C is the nature of the system that both parties are colluding and creating, the system of enmity. And so someone, whatever way this happens, has to be able to step out of that system. I love that poem by Rumi. He says, "There's a field beyond right and wrong. I'll meet you there." Wonderful, so ideally both need to develop that capacity, but at least somebody has to take responsibility for C, for the system. That's very challenging. I mean, I after all these years of my own life, I still have to catch myself with my partner Joan, well, where's C now? Where am I? And to step out of the force of those dynamics that keep you enmeshed and feeling wronged and needing to be right and insulted and avoiding your own guilt and shame, all of that stuff. So some way to begin self-observation and then develop this capacity for self-understanding. How do I make sense of this? Can I see my own armor? Only when we've gone through that process of self-observation, self-understanding, then you can have the third piece, self-transcendence. Oh. Then we can do a different act. Problem is, most of us, we try to get to the different act without all of that work. And this is a huge problem in conflict resolution. And we try and get a peace agreement over the top of really understanding those dynamics and people taking responsibility for their role in perpetuating, colluding in the system. And Northern Ireland is classic. We got a peace agreement, 1998, but guess what? Immediately the day after, they build these 20 feet high peace walls, separating Protestant Catholic community. 25 years, 28 years later, they're still there. Mm-hmm. And when surveys are done, 80% on each side, the Catholic side, the Protestant side, 80% will say, we'd love these walls to come down. But 80% on each side will say, but we don't trust them. What do we have to give up now to have some new relationship that we don't know what it is, because all we've known is enmity. In the absence of that, it just stays intractable. And that's true at that level as it's true in a couple's relationship.
The Gottman Institute teaches bids.
Yes.
And it made me think about what you said fairly early on, is that when you were trying to do technical solutions for syllabus in the schools, there was never an exchange of bids between the Catholic teachers and the Protestant teachers. And the Gottman Institute teaches, at least at the marital counseling level, as I understand it, that within the first 15 minutes to 30 minutes of when they sit down with a couple, they can ascertain with fairly good statistical significance whether or not that couple will be able to endure the counseling based upon the nature of the bids that they pass from one another. If we were really able to, like you say, put a mirror out there and say, okay, I'm going to offer this bid just to see how it will show up in the system and what impact it would have upon the system. Is it received? Is it discarded? Is it not heard?
Yeah, I mean, Gottman talks about what they see in those first moments is contempt. If they see contempt, it's all over. And if you look at the situation we're in here, the contempt that's in the political system, it's horrifying. I mean, it's vile. It's truly vile. And yet it's so prevalent now. And it's who's going to hold up the mirror, you know? Like, and who's going to step outside that system?
Given that we're producing this for Advent and Christmastide season, what is your message of hope, or what is your message of joy that you would like to offer to our listeners if you would be able to do so?
I think we're in a moment where everything that's got us here is breaking down. And it's very frightening. And, you know, it is the desert. We're in the desert in a sense. But on the other hand, I feel we're in a moment where that the global family, because of the internet particularly, and because of the challenges are global, that the global family will come together. And I think the only force that can righten, you know, the world is the force of everybody all at once. It's the human family saying, we're one, we need to take care of each other. You know, we've got to end these power dynamics, end inequality, you know, end the devastation on the earth, you know, all that I think that consciousness is percolating, it's bubbling. So that's where I find, and I keep looking for that good news, the good news, you know, and it's there, it's there like all the time. But it's like, you know, I love this mantra from neuroscience that energy goes where energy flows where attention goes. So where's your attention? So my message to people that keep your attention on, you know, look for the signs of that oneness. Of everything, all the great spiritual traditions have said, you know, we're one, but it's occurring. I really believe it. I really feel that's occurring. So that would be my message, like, keep your attention, keep your energy flowing there rather than all the awful, vile stuff it can easily, we get addicted to that. It's a powerful, you know, our attention gets drawn into that awful, awful morass.
Well,
thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I'm grateful to hear that there are people out there who are willing to do the sort of work that you do. It would be so easy to not do it, to decide that it's somebody else's work or that it's just too hard. My biggest fear for the world is simply that we won't try. I believe we do have the power to succeed when we do try, certainly by the grace of God, this being a religious sort of podcast. But but I am grateful that there are those who have had the work put into their hearts to go out there into the way of danger and to the way of conflict and to speak peace. So that's my little bit of hope for the season, that there are those who continue to do that kind of work, and that God's blessing may be on them.
I would just say that I'm thankful that you went to the car and talked to Mr. X, because I can imagine 90 Jim Strader Sassers saying, "Screw that, I'm not going out there." And because I think the fear rather than the courage would have consumed me. But for some reason, and thanks be to God, thanks be to you or to your spirit that you did that, because you're doing powerful, powerful work. And I too am especially grateful for it. So I hope that you have a blessed holiday season, and may the road rise to meet you, and the sun shine on your back and on your face, and the wind at your back. And perhaps you'll be a guest of ours on the podcast again sometime.
Yeah. The last line of that blessing is, "May God hold you in the palm of her hand."
Yes, indeed, in the palm of her hand. Blessings to you, Hugh. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure.
All righty. Godspeed.
Peace.
Bye-bye.